Coming up on the official Celtic FC podcast, I speak to world-renowned composer and conductor Sir James MacMillan on how he has managed to combine the worlds of classical music and his other great passion, Celtic Football Club. Yes, welcome along to the official Celtic FC podcast. Today I am joined by renowned composer Sir James MacMillan. James has grew up in Cumnock in South Ayrshire and reached the heady heights in the world of classical music. So today we're bringing culture together with Celtic because, like you and me, James's other obsession in the world is Celtic Football Club. So I'm absolutely delighted, James, to welcome you to Celtic, welcome you on the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be back. Very, very exciting to see this wonderful place from up here.
And I'm just wondering, you know, as we try and find some similarities between the world that you inhabit in classical music and Celtic, I was looking down there at the tunnel and I was just thinking about, you know, the aspect of Celtic players coming out into the stadium, the nerves, the adrenaline that they feel in front of a huge audience, and yourself as a conductor coming out onto the stage, perhaps to conduct one of your own works in front of an audience. There are similarities.
I could imagine that there are very strong similarities. In fact, when I look at players standing in the corridor, there are twinges of recognition because that's what I feel like when I'm just about to walk on to conduct a concert. Different scenarios, probably different moods, but it's controlling those nerves that I can see them battling with, and musicians have to cope with that all the time too.
Yeah, and that sense of performance as well. You know, the late great Bertie Auld used to always say it was all about entertainment, and I suppose it's the entertainment industry.
That's right. I mean, being a composer, a lot of my time is spent in solitary confinement, as it were. It was a very quiet, solitary existence, but there's that element in me that just loves being able to perform. Every musician has it. And nowadays, it's as a conductor, and I just love that. It gets me out of the house, of course, but it gets me to work with my fellow musicians, and there's nothing more exciting. And I can see parallels with the great players who play here and similar places.
So, James, we're going to talk about music and Celtic and talk about your childhood and where that love for both music and Celtic came about. But let's start in the present day. I believe right now you're preparing for some big concerts with the BBC SSO.
That's right. My next concert as a conductor is in February with the BBC Scottish Symphony Orchestra. I'm very excited about this one because over the last 10 years, I've been running a little festival of music and the arts in my old hometown of Cumnock. It's called the Cumnock Trist. It's a wonderful little festival, and I've always been keen to mentor the next generation of composers, especially young composers, especially Scottish composers. And my concert in February will contain a piece of mine, but there are works by 6 younger composers, most of whom are from Ayrshire. There must be something in the water down there in Ayrshire that makes music come alive, but also the other arts as well. It's the home of Robert Burns. But I see many young composers, Jay Caparold, for example, from New Cumnock, Michael Murray from another Celtic fan, I think, from Auchinleck, Electra Peravolaris, a very Ayrshire name. She's from Dalry, Scott Lygate, Irvine, and I'm performing all these young composers' music, and that's a great advocacy for someone of my generation to embrace what the youngsters are doing and give them a public platform like that.
Many people not in the classical music world might see it as being just an old-fashioned art. However, what you've just indicated there, is it true that it is still very vibrant, a very vibrant scene in Scotland?
It is, and it's an international scene, of course. It can be small from country to country, but and on one level, those observations are correct. There is a museum culture aspect about classical music, but it's a wonderful museum to have, all those wonderful composers from the past. But it is a living language, and there are still living composers. I'm one, or at least I was the last time I checked. And there's a new generation coming forward, and that's always the case. Classical music has a deep past, but it has a living present and a future as well, and that's very important to me.
So I'm assuming that classical music was something that became a big part of your life at an early age. And I'm assuming as well that Celtic became a big part of your life at an early age. How did both of those passions begin?
They began very differently, but in the same place, in Cumnock. And, my life in music began when the music teacher brought in a bag of plastic recorders and handed them around.
We can remember those days
yeah,
well.
and I admit, for most young kids, it's not the seismic moment in their life that it was for me, but it certainly was. It was like a light going on, and I've never looked back. I wanted to play music. I wanted to be involved in music. I wanted to conduct. I wanted to compose. I wanted to make my own music as well. And more or less at the same time, I began to notice that my male relatives, and especially and my pals at school, my first school in Cumnock was St John's Primary School, were all Celtic daft. And I remember my first games coming up here with my dad. I think it was Celtic against St Johnson. It must have been the late 60s. It was 2 each, I remember that. And but what I remember was, so it was just after Celtic won the European Cup. The most abiding memory was that Jock Stein was driven round the ground at the perimeter in an open top limousine. You don't see that kind of thing these days. And everybody applauded, of course. And these memories are seared into my mind. And so it was Dad's grandfathers. My grandfather used to come up here in the 1930s and 40s. He remembers all the old names. And so you sort of inherit that, you embrace it, it gets into your system. I remember the day when Celtic won the European Cup. I was playing with my cousins in Cumnock, and we were astonished that we won. I don't think it was expected for us to beat Inter Milan that day, I remember the school, we were taught by these rather formidable nuns, Sisters of the Sacred Hearts of Jesus and Mary, and they gave us the day off school the next day after it. They had watched it on the television too. So all those memories, they're wonderful memories, and they're seared into your soul if you've lived through them.
And I suppose as well, what you get as a Celtic supporter through the years is a sense of kinship, a sense of community as well, when you all gather together in a place like Celtic Park with a common hope, a common aim, a common ambition.
Yes, exactly. And in many ways, again, there are parallels with the world of music, where all these disparate people come together through their shared love of music. And that's what people do here at Celtic Park. They come from far and wide, and they share this abiding enthusiasm and obsession. And I've had that since I was very young, both here and at Hampden. I remember my dad taking me to Hampden. The first cup final was a League Cup final. Probably again in the late 60s, maybe 1970, Celtic against Hibs, 6-2 for Celtic. I went with my dad and my uncle Alec. Jimmy Johnson was still playing, so it was right. Some of those fabulous Lisbon Lions. My uncle Alec, who was with us, was a Hibs fan, so I had to put up with a lot that day. Yeah.
And have you, in your professional life, I know, and we can talk about the pieces you've written, inspired by Celtic and actually for some Celtic legends of the past, but has the subject of Celtic ever come up in your professional life as well?
Yes, I make it come up wherever I go. Some people have no idea what I'm talking about. I conduct and go all over the world, and some places they don't have the same connection. But because I go to places like Sydney and Vancouver and Atlanta, I always managed to find out where the local Celtic supporters club was, and I'd watch a game there, usually very early in the morning. I've seen people turn up at some of my concerts with Celtic strips on. I saw that at the Proms a couple of times, to my astonishment. I saw it in Australia once. So there's obviously the connections being made. People are reading the Celtic View or some of the Scottish papers that a few years ago were covering this rather bizarre story. I admit it's a bizarre story, and some people find it bizarre that there's a connection between classical music and football. However, I'm not the only composer, especially in the last 100 years, that has been obsessed with football, and I can reel off a whole range of them, including major figures like Shostakovich, who was a Leningrad Zenit fan, and a qualified referee. And
is that right?
Yes, absolutely. And he was a pretty miserable guy. No wonder, living at the Soviet Union at that time. And most of the photographs are of him looking very sad. If you live under the the cosh of a regime like that. And during the 40s and 50s, he could have disappeared. Some of his colleagues were disappeared because they displeased Stalin and Beria and all the rest of it. But the only happy photographs of Shostakovich are of him attending the games. And you see all those anxieties just disappear. And he's laughing and joking and enjoying the fellowship that he's there with his friends. And so there's him here who wrote a couple of pieces inspired by football. The Golden Age is a ballet, which is about a Soviet football team coming to the West, and the captain of the team gets captured by the secret police or the fascists or something, and his teammates spring him from prison. Imagine making a ballet about that. And he wrote the music for it. And in fact, the other amazing story was that he actually wrote a piece for something called the NKVD Song and Dance Ensemble. And the NKVD were the forerunners of the KGB, who had a song and dance ensemble in the Second World War. And he commissioned by Beria himself, so it's not a commission you turn down, wrote this, God knows what it must have been like, this piece for the KGB's Song and Dance Ensemble. So that's Shostakovich. Martinu, the great Czech composer, was a Sparta Prague fan and there's a piece of his called Half Time. It's dedicated to the fans of Sparta Prague. A friend of mine, Mark Anthony Turnage, is an Arsenal fan, and he works in all these Arsenal chants into his music. Benedict Mason, who's another contemporary of mine, has written an opera called Playing Away, in which the ball has an aria. Believe it or not, I can't imagine what that's like. So I'm not the only nutcase around. There's quite a few of us are obsessed by both things.
That's a good segue into the pieces that you have written about Celtic. So off the top of my head, I know that you have written a short piano piece called For Neil, which is about Neil Lennon. You've I think I'm right in saying you've written a piece for Jim Craig, Lisbon Lion, who was once your dentist. I know that you were commissioned to write a piece for the unveiling of the Brother Walfrid statue here at Celtic Park. And I also believe, rather strangely, you have written a piece of music which you can maybe talk to us about here, which is, you've said yourself that I think you're the only composer who's written a piece of music about the away goals rule, and it's all to do with this famous game here at Celtic Park. I remember it as a young boy being here against Partizan Belgrade.
That's right. It's a piece, my first piano concerto called The Berserking, because everyone was berserk, including all the players in the park. And it's about misdirected energy, really. Celtic in that game won 5-4. I think nearly all the goals were scored by that.
Jakinovsky got 4 of them, yeah.
And he still got knocked out of Europe. He must have wondered what on earth had happened. And it was all because of the away goals rule, because Celtic had lost in the first game over in Europe. And I just found it such a huge convulsion of different kind of emotions that had to have some kind of musical response, hence the piece. But you're right, I'm very proud to be the only composer in musical history to have written a piano concerto inspired by the away goals rule.
The thing about that, I remember back, and having since read about the game as well, is that I remember very clearly people turning to fellow Celtic supporters throughout the game and saying, what's the score? Because the goals were just going in so quickly that people just could not keep track of the score. But you're talking about this misplaced energy in your work, that towards the end of that game, when Celtic were ahead, even on away goals rule, I think there was an instance where Celtic got a throw in and Anton Rogan went to take it so quickly to try and start another attack. And of course, they ended up losing possession, which led to the goal, which put us out.
Yeah. And, it's not program music. It's not a depiction of the game per se, but it's about this idea of taking energy, human energy, musical energy, and making some kind of musical shape out of it. And that's what inspires me sometimes. Composers can be inspired by the strangest things. Over the years they have been. They've got inspiration from events, from people, from emotions. But in my case, in that particular instance, it was a Celtic game.
So what in particular inspired you to write a piece for Jim Craig and Neil Lennon?
Well, the ongoing obsession with football goes on. And then I remember Jim Craig, when I was a boy, he was one of the Lisbon Lions, and I used to see him here in the late 60s, and he was an inspiring figure. And then in later life, in my 30s, he ended up being my dentist in Glasgow. And not that you can have much of a conversation when you're speaking about in your mouth, but it was a revelation, really. And I got to know him reasonably well at the time, and I decided to write a little gift piece for him called the 25th of May 1967.
Yeah.
And it's a bit of a crazy piece. It's a great joyous piece just for solo piano. And then when Neil Lennon came here, I remember him as a player, an inspirational figure, and as a manager. I remember standing over there with my Neil Lennon mask on occasions when he was a player and manager, because we were right close to the opposing fans then, so you could really wind them up by wearing these masks. And I remember meeting him a few times when he was manager, and again, he had a difficult time in Scotland for various reasons, and I felt great empathy and sympathy for him. I wrote this little piece. I was never able to talk to him about it, but I did send him the score. I don't know whether he actually got it. I think Graham Spears actually told him about it, that this mad Scottish composer had written a piece called For Neil, and I think he was completely dumbfounded, didn't really know how to react.
So talk to us about a little bit. I'm interested about the world of classical music, and I suppose the obvious kind of very, very basic question for those who think they know what classical music is what is classical music? I was having to think about that before, and I suppose at a very basic level you could describe classical music as being music created for instruments that were created before electricity. For instance, acoustic instruments. Is it more than that? Because classical music is of a certain period in time, but it's also still going on today.
It's a tricky one because we try to find the right term to describe the overarching culture, which is, let's say, classical music, but it's a misleading term because it does relate to one particular period in history. When musicians talk about the classical period, they're actually only talking about the late 1700s, 1780s to about 1820. So we're talking about Mozart, Haydn, and early Beethoven. But we know that the world of art music, which might be a better term, precedes that by centuries. It goes right back to the Middle Ages. And it's alive today. So it's a tricky term. I sometimes have difficult conversations with taxi drivers who ask me what I do for a living, and explain I'm a composer and what kind of music, classical music. So, and then the conversation at one time certainly just veered immediately onto Pavarotti. And of course, Pavarotti was a great singer, but nothing to do with what I do. So it's a tricky one to describe, but it's a musical culture with a very deep origins, going back to, you could say, the 11th, 12th century. The famous names coming out of that are Palestrina, Bach, Handel, of course. Then the others I've mentioned, Mozart, Beethoven, Haydn. Then into the 19th century, Wagner, Bruckner, Brahms. Into the 20th century, Richard Strauss, Mahler, Schoenberg, and then the avant-garde, of course, that made such a big mark on music in the mid-20th century, and now into the 21st century. And people are still writing for great musicians, whether it be orchestras, soloists, choirs. That's my world. I'm writing a piece just now for choir and orchestra together. That piece will be performed next year, and then I begin my 6th symphony, and that will be played by orchestras in Europe and elsewhere. So that's my world, that's my classical music, but trying to explain it in a nutshell to people who are maybe making first encounter with it can be quite a long, drawn-out process.
For someone who perhaps is watching this podcast and thinking, I don't know anything about classical music, but James is making it sound interesting, are there any particular pieces of classical music that you would recommend for kind of like an introductory listener?
Wow.
You've got a lot to choose from.
Yes, all the ones I've mentioned. We talked about Shostakovich earlier. Shostakovich wrote about 14 or 15 symphonies. This is the Soviet football fan and referee. The Fifth Symphony would be a fabulous piece. He wrote it in the lead up to the Second World War. His Leningrad Symphony was written during the siege of Leningrad when the Nazis were actually bombing it. Listen to that piece and you hear the anxiety of war, which is in recent history. So you're confronted with music, in a sense, of our time. The 20th century. He died in 1975. Beyond going back through time, I fell in love with Wagner's music when I was young, and I still haven't recovered. Some of his music is just wonderful. He's a figure that divides opinion both musically and morally, because he was kind of co-opted by the Nazis as a kind of great German figure. But they did that with lots of German composers. Germany is a land full of wonderful composers that came before and after Wagner. And then even before the so-called classical time, I would highlight Baroque composers like Bach, whose music I love. And then even before the Baroque music, there was people like Palestrina who were writing music in Rome in the Sistine Chapel in the 1600s. And that's me going back through history. There's
I can picture all the Celtic supporters on Spotify making their classical music playlists as we speak.
Yeah.
James, I'm interested to know how you go about composing music. If you're a composer of an instrumental piece and you play that instrument, let's say it's a piano piece and you are a pianist, and you can compose as you're playing that piece of music. Therefore, you can hear it. You can hear what you're composing. You're talking about you're composing a piece currently for choir and orchestra. You cannot possibly physically hear that as you're composing it. So how do you know that what you are writing on that manuscript is going, or how do you know how it's going to sound?
Through practice, but you've got to train your imagination, and that's a musician's aspiration, is to hear things actually in silence, to hear things in your head. Yes, what we can use the piano to check things, and through history, composers have always used the piano. And nowadays, I see a lot of the younger composers using technology to help them. They can write their music onto computer screens, and they can hear some kind of version of it played back immediately. I've always counselled against that. I do a lot of teaching with young composers, and I said, try and wean yourself off the technology and even the piano, because the sound of the piano, and indeed the sound of the technology, can be very misleading. If I'm writing a piece for choir or, I don't know, solo violin, the last sound I want to hear is the sound of a piano, because it's just a misleading sound. So I've got to make it work. It's like a muscle you train over years of study. And musicians beginning their journey as children have to submit themselves to ear tests, and so that they actually hear things without the aid of an instrument or technology. And it's the best training you can get. If you can actually train yourself to hear a piece of music, even just a short burst of music, in the silence of your own head, you're well on the way to being a composer. And that's what I tell the young students that study with me sometimes.
It's one thing being able to hear the music in your head, but then being able to put that down onto manuscript. Is that another skill on top of that?
I suppose so. I mean, it's connected. You hear it in the silence of your own heart, and then you've got to imagine how you're going to communicate those sounds to your fellow musicians, who will take the score and the parts and have to play it back. And it's a lifelong journey that every composer embarks upon as soon as you start a life of music as a child. And that's what happened to me. You know, I mentioned these little plastic recorders way back in the 1960s in my Cumnock primary school. That was like a light going on. And it began a life in music that still fills me with fascination and love for what I do. But it has to begin somewhere. And, music teachers are very, very important people for that reason, just to introduce young people to any kind of music, because you can have a love affair with music. I think people, it doesn't matter what kind of music we're talking about, but when I talk to my fellow music lovers in the classical or arts music, I recognise that we share this love. It's a love of the music we encountered when we were young and that we live with it obsessively as adults. Hearing it, going to hear it, hearing new performances of well-loved pieces, perhaps exciting a curiosity to hear a new piece that you'd never heard before. That takes a kind of love, and it's a love affair that enhances my life and sort of makes me get up in the morning and do what I do.
Just interesting thinking about what you said about hearing a piece in silence. I suppose that explains, famously, most people will know that Beethoven, for a lot of his life, was profoundly deaf. Is that why someone like him was able to continue composing some of his most famous works? Because he didn't need to hear it, because he heard it inside?
That's exactly it. He was completely deaf by the end of his life and spent the last productive, some say the best years of his life in total deafness, but yet he heard it all in his head. Now, it's a drastic solution, a drastic suggestion that we should all be like that in some way, but in a sense, that's what we need to do. We need to be deaf to certain things. We need to be deaf to distractions so that music can percolate and grow in silence, in deafness, if you like, where you're oblivious to what's going on around about you. And he certainly was. He lived obsessively for his music. He had no choice. But some of us have to do something similar in a parallel way.
I've heard songwriters talk about the fact that they don't feel really in control of when the inspiration is going to come, when the melody is going to come to them. They carry notepads around with them. Sometimes they may just sit in front of a piano at a particular time in the evening in case something comes to them. Is that what it's like for you as a composer? Are you very rigid in the sense that you will get up, start composing at 9 and finish at 5, or are you always kind of alert and aware that inspiration may come?
I try to be disciplined in that I have every day is available to me to fill with writing, with my own music. But it doesn't really work like that. Sometimes things can go very, very silent and there's nothing there. And you've just got to be patient. And I speak to a lot of my younger colleagues who sometimes get worried about that. They talk about the equivalent of a writer's block and how do I deal with it. And what I say to them is that there's no such thing as a block. I mean, what happens is that the inspiration goes underground in your own mind. It goes subliminal. It goes into your sleep patterns. It goes into your subconscious, your semi-conscious. And sometimes the music grows even when you're not aware of it. And suddenly you become aware of it, maybe days, weeks, months later, and you realise it's been growing and you hadn't really noticed it. And I think that's what happens in music for musicians. And so one has to come at that with a degree of patience and hope, in that, there's nothing much going on up here this day, there's no music happening, but many weeks later you realise, this was happening, and I wasn't even aware it was happening. So it's a curious thing. One has to be ready, patient, willing, open to catch the fragments of inspiration as they come and go.
Yeah, before we perhaps finish up back on the football, in terms of music, you mentioned, the inspiration you got from school, and how music teachers are still very important. How do you feel about the way that the music education is funded in schools just now, and how important that early introduction to music can inspire children? Not necessarily, and probably not going on to become world-renowned composers and conductors, but it can give them an inspiration for something else. It can help in their growth.
I think it's vital. I've always seen music as one of the basics of education, and people involved in music and the arts make that case to those in power a lot. Sometimes we're listened to, a lot of the time we're not. So we're having to advocate all the time that music and the arts are an important part of our education, and shouldn't just be seen as some kind of frivolous add-on, which is the view of some. Because music, a study of music, helps in so many other ways. It can make you more numerate. There's a connection between music and maths. the performance of music involves a social activity where you learn to collaborate and work with your fellows. But you learn you learn a path to something beautiful, which is the real worth of it. I mean, why should people without access to money and means be denied that access to beauty? And, you know, I grew up in, as I say, in Ayrshire, in East Ayrshire. My parents weren't well off. They were of very modest means. My grandfather was a coal miner, and like most of the men in Cumnock area. But yet they had this love of music. And it's we should never lose that. And we should never let communities in Cumnock and East Ayrshire lose that connection with the path to beauty. The path to something really spiritually transformative. And so it's important. I work with a lot of young people. As I mentioned, I set up this festival, the Cumnock Trice, 10 years ago, to work specifically with young people and older people in places like Cumnock and Auchinleck and New Cumnock and Mauchline and all the places where I hung about as a boy, because maybe there will be people there that will want to follow a life in music as I did. I've had a wonderful life because a spark was ignited in Cumnock in the late 60s, and if I can ignite more sparks like that in places like Cumnock, well and good. And it means sometimes we work with teachers. I'm not a teacher, but I'm in schools a lot and working with young composers. As you're probably aware, composition's part of the music curriculum in higher, advanced higher, and south of the border too. And some teachers are a bit terrified by it. So we at the Cumnock Trice want to help, and we go into schools, Robert Burns Academy and in Cumnock recently, St Joseph's Academy in Kilmarnock recently, and we've worked these wonderful composition projects for teenage composers. And not all of them will want to follow my kind of life, but it might enhance some of their appreciation of music, their love of music, but it also gives them a self-confidence in how to deal with adults like me, with musicians, to talk about an abstract art form. To be able to talk about something as abstract as music is a huge intellectual gift. And if we can help them, I mean, we did a course like that in Doon Academy in Domellington, and the kids were very, very quiet and they'd never done anything like it before. But at the end of the project, all of them, 9 of them, and 8 of them were young women, had written a string quartet for the Edinburgh String Quartet, which was performed by these professional musicians at the Trice. And not only that, Channel 4 News and the BBC got wind of it and came and interviewed them. So these kids who were silent and shy to begin with, eventually were giving interviews to Channel 4 News and BBC Scotland. And at the beginning of that course, that would have been probably impossible for them.
Wow, and I'm thinking about it as again, sort of relating it back to football and the life of a footballer. You know, a player like Callum McGregor or James Forrest doesn't get to the level that they're at without dedication and without having a discipline and a real focus on something. They put in the 10,000 hours, as Gordon Strachan would famously say, and music, I guess, similar to that, gives you that discipline.
Absolutely, I can see parallels all the time.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking in the future, you've been inspired in the past by Celtic heroes and famous times. I wonder if there may be a spark in the future. You know, Brendan Rodgers is doing some big things here. Will there be a Brendan Rodgers symphony in the future?
Who knows? I mean, the obsession continues. There is a piece of music. It's not a Celtic piece, but it is a football piece, just simply called 11. And it was a Trice-inspired piece, so it has a Cumnock connection. When I was a boy, I used to go and watch Cumnock Juniors, but you can't really be specific about that anymore if we're working with all these communities, because there's Auchinleck Talbot, of course, and Glenafton Athletics. So I dedicated this piece, 11, to all the fans of Cumnock Juniors, Auchinleck Talbot, Glenafton Athletic, Muirkirk Juniors, and Lugar Boswell Thistle, just to cover them all. And that piece is played all over the world. I heard it recently in Sweden, and it's full of chants I heard at the junior games, and still heard at junior games. when we did it in Cumnock, I conducted it in Cumnock at the Trist Festival last year, and the audience was made up of local people who recognised the chants. And I
From
could
the
hear,
games?
yeah, and I could hear giggles and so on throughout the audience. I don't think that will happen in Stockholm and Minneapolis, but it was really a wonderful feeling, as if the music had come home. And the name 11, of course, it's the 11 players, but for a musician, is 11 notes, 11 notes in a chord, 11 durations, 11 instruments. I just began to play around with all these number games. Football, music, numbers, I love them all. And when they can collaborate and congeal into one, it's great. So who knows? There may very well be a Brendan Rodgers piece in the future.
Just finally, James, how can people get more information about yourself, your work, the projects that you've got going on just now? Where can they go to find out more?
Well, the first encounter could be with the BBC Scottish Symphony Orchestra on the 20th of February at the City Halls, where I'll conduct these Ayrshire composers. But beyond that, it'd be worth visiting my publisher's website. I'm published by Boozy and Hawkes, and they have special pages for all their composers. So click onto Boozy's, click onto my name, and you will find all the news and information about all these different pieces, including all these Celtic pieces and football pieces, programme notes and so on. My agents are Intermusica in London, and they have their website, and they put out information. And another plug, of course, is for the Cumnock Trist. It's been a labour of love for me. It's a huge obsession and love to bring music back to East Ayrshire in that way. So the Cumnock Trist has a website as well. And we're winning awards right, left and centre. We won a Sky Arts Award last year, which was the icing on the cake for us.
Fantastic. Well, I must say it's been a pleasure to listen to you and to bring these two worlds of classical music and Celtic together. Sir James MacMillan, thank you very much for joining us on the official Celtic FC podcast.
Thank you very much.